You can't hear me? Do I turn this up a little bit? Yeah? Okay, I'll keep talking louder. Let's see how this works. So I'm going to talk about social media as cultural tools for adolescent psychological development. So in the title of my talk, Millennials Go Online to Build Their Offline Lives, the idea is that the offline and the online worlds are not separate spheres, but instead the online world is like a cultural tool, is a tool that we use to construct ourselves, to build our offline lives. And these tools introduce a new scale into our everyday lived experiences. So I like sociocultural theory, Lev Vygotsky, if any of you have heard of Vygotsky before. He argued that psychological development is a process by which children and adolescents learn to regulate their mental activities in culturally particular ways through engagement with products of society. So products of society are like cultural artifacts, we might call them. They can be material tools like our mobile devices, our computers, and they can also be symbolic tools like language or counting systems that shape how we think about the world. So in my research, I've examined how millennials have taken up the affordances of social media. So affordances are like opportunities for action. And how they've taken up these affordances to accomplish developmental tasks in the transition from childhood to adulthood. So the first developmental task I'm going to talk about today is building social capital. Social capital is defined most simply as potential or actual resources that are generated in our relationships. So in the United States, adolescents expand their relationship reach and increasingly build sources of social support outside the family on their way to becoming an adult in a post-industrialized democratic society. So one of the first studies that I conducted as a PhD student at UCLA was an online survey study with US college students examining how they use Facebook to construct their social networks and accumulate social capital. So the typical Facebook network size is about 400 friends, and we titled the study, Me and My 400 Friends. And loose ties comprise the largest proportion of their network. So loose ties were friends of friends or acquaintances, people they knew from certain kinds of activities, but they weren't close friends. And college students grew their networks not by adding strangers, but by particularly adding this type of loose tie. So the larger their networks, the greater proportion overall of these loose ties, and the more that they perceive Facebook to be a useful tool for social support, both emotional support and also tangible support. So our findings back in 2012 were consistent with other studies, suggesting that social network sites like Facebook have extended young people's capacity to build social resources, especially what's called bridging social capital. This is a kind of social capital that's generated in loose kinds of relationships. Loose relationships are easily dissolved and formed. They're more fluid, they're more mobile, they're more flexible. And bridging social capital includes resources like access to non-redundant, novel information, new perspectives, diverse perspectives, and a sense of belonging and investment in a heterogeneous, amorphous, large community. Now contrast this typical network of young adults in the United States with the networks of young adults in my field site in southern Mexico, a Maya community called Zinacantan. So these data are based on interviews with a sample of 68 young adults, they were in their very early 20s, in the community of Zinacantan in southern Mexico. So on average, they reported having just 19 people in their networks as opposed to 400. And rather than loose ties, the largest proportion of their networks were family or kin-based relationships, like cousins, uncles, aunts, and grandparents, and so forth. Now, to be clear, the method by which I constructed these social networks is quite different in the United States and in Zinacantan, but that's because the cultural tools for building social networks are different in these two locales. So for example, the internet is still quite new in this Maya community. It's not yet widespread. So I couldn't ask all my participants about their Facebook networks because many of them hadn't been online yet. And so instead I asked them to use a concentric set of circles, on a piece of notebook paper, there we go. It's a set of concentric circles on a piece of notebook paper, and I asked them to tell me about the people in their lives. So in the middle circle there, I wrote the word tu, or you, and then asked them to write the names of all the people in that inner circle, people that they felt so close to that they couldn't imagine life without them. And in the second circle, I instructed them to write the names of people who they might not feel that close to, but still are very important to them. And then in the outer circle, they were instructed to write the names of all the people who are important enough in their lives that they should be included in their personal social networks. So as you can see, people in the inner circle were almost always family members. On average, 96% were kin-based relationships. The majority of people in the middle and outer circles were also primarily family relationships, kinship relationships. And so family is still a fundamental unit for social capital in Xena Canton. This is a tight-knit, insular Maya community. Many still live in patrifocal extended families. They adhere to traditional gender roles. Travel outside the community is rare, except for those who are heavily involved in commerce. And they continue to speak Tzotzil, not Spanish, although Spanish speaking is growing with increasing levels of formal schooling in the community. So I interviewed young adults in Xena Canton to test whether the new communication tower, which was installed in 2010, whether it might be shifting how young people in this community build social capital, build social resources, and then to explore the psychological ramifications of this shift. There we go. Okay. So I found evidence that millennials in Xena Canton who are pioneering the internet were using social networking sites like Facebook to build bridging social capital and looser social ties. So 63% of the young adults in my sample used the internet, and among those participants, 56% had used Facebook. And formal schooling beyond elementary school was a significant predictor of internet use and Facebook use. What I did was I compared the proportion of non-kin members in the social networks of those who had used Facebook and those who had never used Facebook. So this graph shows Facebook users in blue and non-Facebook users in red, and then the proportion of non-kin in their network is on the y-axis. So as you can see, on average, men tended to have a larger proportion of chosen non-familiar relationships in their networks compared to women. But for both genders, for both women and men, Facebook increased the proportion of non-kin in their networks in more or less a parallel fashion. So interestingly, this is not the case when comparing those with and without secondary schooling, which is still quite new in the community. So on this graph, blue represents young adults who had been to high school, and the red line represents young adults who had never been to high school. They had just an elementary education. So the graph shows that high school attendance made a bigger difference for men than it did for women in facilitating social connections beyond the family. Men without a high school education and women in general had 10 to 20% of their networks filled with connections outside the family. In contrast, for men who had been to high school, 40% of their networks comprised connections outside the family. So whereas Facebook use had parallel effects on both women and men's social networks, women's introduction into public social life through secondary schooling did not increase their social connections outside the family on par with men. So these data suggest that social media could be a more powerful tool than educational institutions in providing women in the global south with opportunities to forge and maintain certain kinds of bridging social capital. In this case, social contacts outside the family network who could provide economic opportunities or new information or alternative perspectives. And indeed, this is what I found in my field work there in Xena Canton. Many of the women were transforming traditional weavings into products to sell to tourists, and they used Facebook to connect to buyers in Mexico City or to connect to tour guides to get the tour guides to bring tourists to their homes and buy some of their weavings. So importantly, I want to say that I didn't find any differences in overall network size between men or women or those who used technology and those who didn't. It wasn't the overall network size that differed. It was specifically the proportion of non-kin in the family that differed between those who used Facebook and those who didn't, and those who had been to high school among men anyways. So going back to Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, this Russian psychologist argued that we use cultural tools to change the environment with our external activity, and in that process we affect our own thinking, our own behavior. So this is the way that we regulate our thinking, the way we regulate our behavior is primarily through cultural tools. So the question then arises, as young people in the global south and other parts of the world use the internet to transform their social environments, might they also be changing the ways they think about human relationships? So to get at this idea, my interviews in Zina Canton also included open-ended questions, asking participants about their perceptions of change with the introduction of the new communication tower in their community, and I qualitatively analyzed their answers and found evidence for shifting mental models of social relations. So I'm going to show you a quote from a young man who had been to university and was a frequent Facebook user. He said, "The perspectives of my generation are really different because my parents' perspectives, they only worried about themselves, not so much their companions, just the common good of their families. In comparison, the perspective of a youth today is to help another person. Say a young man doesn't know how to do something, well, I will teach him, and then we're going to get to know each other better. It is this perspective that is increasing." So I find this fascinating that this young man constructs a focus on the family as selfish or asocial in some way, and then cultivation of relationships outside the family as virtuous. His perspective illustrates psychological transformations in values, ideals, beliefs, meanings for relationships that can arise when social media is integrated into developmental tasks during the transition to adulthood. Perhaps the capacity to build networks outside the family entails a greater sense of trust in strangers, positive attitudes towards strangers, and at least among some youth in Zina Canton, the use of social network sites might facilitate conceptions of the self as responsible for and invested in heterogeneous social webs of others. So my research on this topic is ongoing. I'm actually about to return to Zina Canton in just about 2 weeks, and I'm going to continue to follow adolescents, and I'm also going to interview parents as well to continue to explore this question about psychological change with social media use and technology use. I've also studied identity development, the implications of social media for identity development among U.S. millennials, U.S. college students. So this brings us to our second major developmental task in the transition from childhood to adulthood, identity development. Developmental psychologist Susan Harder defines identity as a self-system comprising value-laden cognitive schemas. We can think of cognitive schemas as almost like neural networks or networks of associations, mental frameworks that guide our interpretation and our self-understanding. So the self-system guides our behaviors, it guides our intentions, our desires, our attributions. Adolescence is a profound period of cognitive and affective restructuring of one's self-system. And as any armchair observer of teenagers will tell you, peer relationships are essential in this process of self-construction. Peers scaffold, they help one another. So identity development, helping each other formulate, explore, and commit to certain kinds of identities. So if we construct ourselves through reciprocal and dynamic feedback loops with others, then how might expansive social networks filled with bridging social capital and digitally mediated communication practices change this developmental process? So this is the big question that I'm really interested in. I'm going to tell you about one study that sort of chips away at this big picture question. My colleague and I at the University of Michigan wondered whether Facebook introduced certain kinds of behaviors, namely a one-to-many style of interaction in a highly visual medium. So we have another theme about a very visual medium that is getting introduced with the internet. So we were wondering if interactions in this space might shape the sense of the self as an external evaluator. To put it more simply, we wondered whether external appearances have become more important in millennial youth's self-evaluations compared to generations of the past. So to answer this question, Monique Ward and I and my colleague at Michigan went backwards in time, so to speak, to data that were collected in the years before this cascade of social media use in daily life. This is a visual depiction of the explosion in social media. It starts in 1994. MySpace appears on the scene in 2003, Facebook in 2004, and my colleague and I came on the scene in 2012. We collected data with a sample of college students in the winter of 2012 and compared them to data from an equivalent sample of college students, data that was collected in 2002, right before the widespread use of Facebook and MySpace. So the 2012 sample is essentially the first cohort of U.S. Young adults experiencing their entire teen lives with Facebook. So each of the samples consisted of about 600 students at the University of Michigan, Both samples were similar in ethnicity. They were primarily white. They were similar in parent education, religiosity, Greek affiliation. They were similar in the time they spent watching TV and music videos, although the 2012 sample watched far fewer movies per month compared to the 2002 sample. Identical scales of friendship attachment were administered to each sample. So this scale measures the extent to which one feels close and supported by your close friends. And then we administered a contingency of self-worth measure to both samples. So this scale consists of 11 items. It's lists of positive and negative events related to physical appearance, such as you gained 10 pounds or you were complimented on your hairstyle. So participants are asked to rate how they would respond to each of these events if it happened to them on a scale from -3, I would feel horrible about myself, to +3, wow, I would feel wonderful about myself. And then average scores are calculated based on absolute values, departing from 0, which is anchored at I would feel the same about myself. So in other words, the scale measures a self-system constructed on schemas related to one's external appearances, so the importance of one's appearances to feeling good about the self. So in the 2012 sample, we also asked them to report about their Facebook use, to complete a short-form inventory of narcissistic personality traits, and we asked them to complete the aspirational index, which measures the relative importance of various future goals, one of which is fame. Okay, so first I'll describe what we found comparing friendship closeness across the two samples. So this variable is on a 1 to 5 scale, with higher numbers indicating greater feelings of closeness to friends. We found no significant differences in friendship closeness in the 2002 and the 2012 samples. The means were almost identical, and in general, they felt pretty good about their friendships. They felt supported and close to their friends, almost a 4 on a 1 to 5 scale. So although this time lag assessment of psychological change indicated that friendship closeness among college students had not changed with the advent of social networking sites, the tools that support friendship are changing, and we found evidence to support our hypothesis that these tools for relationship maintenance contribute to a greater salience of appearances in one's self-worth. So appearance self-worth is now on the scale to 0 to 3 scale, with higher values indicating a greater emphasis on external appearances in one's self-worth. We did a regression analysis controlling for any differences, sociodemographic, media use differences in the two samples, and found statistically significant differences in the 2012 and the 2002 sample. So the 2012 sample showed more intense fluctuations in their reported self-worth in response to positive and negative events related to their external appearance. The mean fluctuation from 0 on the self-worth measure in 2002 was 1.66, and in 2012 it was 1.78. So the effect size is not huge, but it is statistically significant, and it did provide evidence to support our theory, our hypothesis, that appearances are becoming increasingly important in constructing the self when young people in the U.S. began using social media to interact with their friends. We found further evidence for the role of Facebook in identity development when we analyzed associations between Facebook use, the variables on the left side of the table, and various facets of the self-system, their apparent self-worth, their narcissistic personality traits, and their aspirations for fame. So years of Facebook use, the longer they had used Facebook, the more time per day they spent on Facebook, the more they used Facebook to passively observe others, and the more they used Facebook to actively interact, posting photos, expressing themselves online. All of these variables were statistically significantly associated with apparent self-worth in 2012. Facebook active and Facebook passive use was also associated with greater narcissistic personality traits and a greater priority placed on fame and one's future aspirations. Narcissism was also associated with years of Facebook use, longer period of time using Facebook, and frequency of use was associated with fame aspirations. So these correlations were the same for women and men. We didn't find any gender differences. And the only kind of Facebook activity that was associated with friendship closeness was the Facebook active use. And as you can see from these correlations, Facebook active use was the variable that was most strongly associated with apparent self-worth and narcissistic personality traits. Now, we're not the first. Many other theorists have argued that in the late modern era, image-oriented processes of identity formation had increased. Our data suggests that social media are products born from these cultural trends and which are now tools integrated into young people's social relationships, potentially magnifying sources of self-worth and validation in their self-systems that come from external appearances. So I thought I'd end the talk today with a reference to a wonderful book that I read last summer when I was making my way down the West Coast. I was moving from my previous university, Western Washington University, to my current faculty position at UC Santa Cruz. The book is The Artificial Ape by archaeologist Timothy Taylor. Taylor introduces the book with this question: how did the weakest ape come out on top? So he describes how our relationships with cultural artifacts is the critical point of distinction between humans and other animals, a relationship which enables us to undermine principles of natural selection that operate on a biological level. He argues that human evolution is not a blindly operating system of natural selection, but it's inertia produced by technological advancements that have escaped us. So he says that we long ago began adapting our minds and bodies to a hidden agenda, and by this he means the logic and principles of a third system of artifice, which are emergent properties of a system of biology and then the level of physics. And he says the result is a symbiotic form of life, referring to gene-culture coevolution with technologies and other cultural artifacts contributing to the transformation of our minds, brains, and our bodies. So we use technology and artifacts not just to manipulate the laws of physics when we drive up a hill, for example, or to subvert the biological when we offload our mental tasks, our memories to computers, but we also use cultural tools profoundly to construct ourselves. So I would argue that a developmental psychological perspective is essential to understanding processes of human change and adaptation at this level of artifice. Examining how cultural tools are integrated into developmental tasks in various contexts around the world can illuminate the kinds of skills, competencies, cognitive and emotional patterns, values that are learned and cultivated using these cultural tools and that are transmitted and transformed across generations. So thanks so much for listening. I had a great time putting together this talk. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'd love to hear from you. I'm just finished my first year at UC Santa Cruz, starting off the Culture and Technology Lab. Here's my email. I'd love to welcome any kinds of comments. So thanks so much.